Hello once again, and welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're in the middle of class number 12, talking about the different kinds of Jewish rabbis that were living and working during the time of Jesus, as well as before and after. And if you look at these, there are basically two kinds that we want to discuss. One are Torah teachers, and the others are rabbis with smicha. We'll explain that more in just a moment. The Torah teachers were men who were highly respected and loved in their synagogues and communities. They had studied the Old Testament, the Tanakh, their whole lives, and in particular, they had focused on the Torah, or Torah, depending on how you want to say that, what we would call also the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And these men not only had studied it, but they had memorized it. They knew it entirely by heart and could recite any part of it. They could teach in different ways about it. They could tell stories from the Torah or tell stories about the Torah. They could connect ideas from all over the Torah. If you ask them how many different kinds of sacrifices are mentioned in the Torah, how many different birds are mentioned, they could pull those out from memory and compare and contrast and collate all the information in amazing ways. They could think of different ways to teach it and ways to apply it in your lives. But there's one limitation. They couldn't teach new doctrine that had not been approved already by the community and by rabbis with smicha. So they had certain boundaries they couldn't go beyond. They couldn't extrapolate new ideas, but they had to remain within those boundaries that had already been put in place by those who went before. These men had a certain pattern of teaching. And they had 3 steps, basically. First of all, they would say, "It is written," and then they would cite the text that they were going to teach that day. Number 2, they would say, "And this means," and then they would explain what the text said with parables, alliteration, or other teaching tools to make sure that their audience understood it. And then third, they had to cite an authority to support their teaching, such as Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Hillel, famous rabbis from Jewish history, so that people would know they weren't inventing anything new, but that what they were teaching had already been put in place. And so these were men, again, that were greatly respected and loved. These were the men that were in charge of the education of the young people, young boys and girls that went and started school at 5 years old. These Torah teachers were the ones that had that responsibility. And if you look at movies like Fiddler on the Roof, for example, you see the respect in which that rabbi is held. You get an idea about the relationship and the work of these rabbis in the community of the Jews. Now, there was another kind of rabbi we call rabbi with smicha, and smicha in Hebrew means authority. Authority. And these men were everything the Torah teachers were, plus, because they also had studied the Bible, the Tanakh, their whole lives. They had memorized not only the Torah, but also the rest of the Old Testament, what's called the Haftorah. They knew the whole thing by heart, which is just amazing to me. There's a story that Ray Vanderland, another teacher of this kind of material, tells about when he went into his first doctoral class with 31 other students, Jewish students. He said there were 32 students in class, and everyone else besides me had the Old Testament memorized. That would be so intimidating. Just amazing how these men loved the text and worked so hard to memorize it. And of course, they were exceptional professors. By having all this memorized, they knew how to work with it, use examples, parables, any kind of teaching in order to communicate the truth of the Word of God. Some of these men included also were recorded as healing other people, which is a little bit unusual. I kind of thought that maybe Jesus was the only rabbi that ever healed, but according to some other extra biblical text, we see examples of these men healing others. And so they were the ones that were given permission to be able to teach new ideas, new interpretations and doctrines from God that no one had taught before. And then the Torah teachers then could take what these rabbis with smicha had said, and they could teach that from that point on. Now, there's also a certain pattern of teaching with these rabbis. They would say, it is written, and they would cite the text, just like the Torah teachers. Then they would say, you have heard that it was said, and they would mention what had been taught before. And then third, they would say, but I say to you, and then they would add what may be a new interpretation or a new extrapolation of what the text meant. And these rabbis with Shmika were the only ones that could do that. You see how they kind of went beyond what was already known and taught and added something new to it. And you think about it, who speaks like this in the New Testament? You go to places like, for example, Matthew chapter 7, you see how the people responded to Jesus. Or Matthew chapter 21, you see them talking with Jesus about the authority. And basically, it's Jesus who teaches this way all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to go to one passage, this one that I mentioned here, and go to Matthew 21, beginning in verse 23. And we see an example of this kind of questioning between the Jews and a rabbi. It says here in Matthew 21:23, Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things, they asked, and who gave you this authority? And the word there really in Hebrew could be, by what smicha are you doing these things, and who gave you this smicha? Jesus replied, I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what smicha I'm doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or from men? They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he'll ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, we're afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. Then he said, neither will I tell you by what smicha I'm doing these things. And so again, this is a pretty common thing for a Jew to ask a rabbi. If the rabbi was unknown, if or was new, if he came from another place, then this is a very common question. Do you have smicha? And who gave you your smicha? All right. It's kind of like if we had a person interviewing for a position of professor at a university, then one of the first questions would be, where did you receive your training? Where did you get your PhD? Who were some of the professors that trained you in your school? Very normal questions. And if you said, well, I don't have a PhD, or if you say this university and nobody recognizes the university, or maybe it's a questionable university, then they'd have serious problems with your credentials. So we're talking about Jesus' credentials in this conversation. We don't know about your smicha. We want to make sure that you've been given authority to teach the way that you're teaching. So this kind of question then suggests another question: how do you get smicha? And basically, there were several things you could do, but some of the most important ones. First of all, you had to know the Old Testament from memory. Well, that will knock out a lot of people right there. And then the more important ones were that two other rabbis with smicha had to publicly lay hands on you and declare that before everyone that you also had authority from God to offer new teachings. And so it was one of these things that kind of went in a chain. These rabbis had smicha, they passed it on publicly, then you had smicha, you could eventually pass that on to somebody else. But you had to have your two people to back you up, just as if in the Jewish law, for example, two witnesses were required to confirm something. This is just another example of that. And so you think about this idea of rabbis with smicha. These were the men who had talmidim. Talmid is a disciple in Hebrew. Talmidim is plural. So these are the ones who could go around and teach these young men from 15 to 30 that we talked about last time, who spent years and years preparing to be rabbis and wanted to become like the rabbi. The rabbis with smicha were the ones that had these men. So the next question that's a natural question is, then what were Jesus's two authorities so that he could have smicha in a way that the Jews and others would understand and approve? Well, if you look back in there, you might think through Jesus' ministry, who affirmed Jesus. Luke 3 and Matthew 3 tell the story of Jesus' baptism, right? And it says that John himself affirmed that Jesus was the one that came from God. And so that's one, because John the Baptist is held as a good teacher and a prophet, and so that would carry a lot of weight with people. And then the second was actually God himself from heaven when he spoke in Jesus' baptism, this is my son whom I love, right? And then later on from the mountain of the transfiguration, listen to him. That's smicha, authority straight from God. It doesn't get any better than that. And so Jesus had not only smicha, but smicha from the highest authorities, all right? So you think about this concept of Jesus as a rabbi with smicha, and all of what that meant then for a Jew that understands this system. So you go again to passages where it talks about Jesus picking his followers, because this rabbi with smicha would have followers. So let's jump over to Luke chapter 11. And I'm sorry, Luke chapter 5, and read verses 1 through 11. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret with the people crowding around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out in the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I'll let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men." So they pulled up their boats on shore, left everything, and followed him. Okay, so this first story, you kind of see why they want to follow him. Just an amazing thing. And so he says, now you'll catch men. So in essence, he's calling them to be his talmidim, his followers. Okay, and if you remember, just before we go on and read these other passages, you think about how people usually were accepted as followers of a rabbi with smicha. Remember in the class about Jesus' childhood, we talked about how not everybody was accepted. In fact, unless you knew the Old Testament from memory, you really couldn't even get into the game. You had to be an exceptional student, maybe 1 out of 1,000. Then you had to go apply with a rabbi, and then he would decide if he would accept you or not. So you look at these men here, and it doesn't necessarily seem like they're following that pattern. It doesn't say that they were well prepared and went and asked Jesus, and he considered the application and accepted them. It says they were already working in their jobs. So it's most likely that they may have made it past the first role, maybe not even past the first level of memorizing the Old Testament or memorizing the law, but that perhaps they finished their education then and went to learn their father's trades there. Now, if you jump over to these other passages we have listed here, Matthew 4:18 talks about Jesus calling all of the disciples. It says, as he was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will make you fishers of men." Not quite the same story, but similar aspects to it as Luke 5. At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. If you go to other passages, say like in Matthew 9 and 10 and Luke 9, you see listings of all of the apostles then. And in one passage, it talks about how he prayed all night before then he called the 12 that would be his apostles, his talmidim, the ones that would follow him. Now, there's another interesting passage here that we want to mention. over in John chapter 15. And this is on the last night of his life, and he's reminding the disciples of some of the way that they came to be his disciples. And it says, verse 16, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last." Now that first phrase is very significant, because normally the disciples would go and they would seek to be accepted. You wouldn't have the rabbi going out and having to recruit. They would come to him. And yet Jesus kind of flips it here and says, you didn't choose me. You didn't come and apply to me. I went out and I chose you. And for people that were hearing this, they would understand this was an honor for the disciples to be chosen in this way, in kind of a double fashion. One, because they were called by a rabbi with smicha. That was a great honor. And any parent would be proud if a rabbi with smicha called his son to be a follower. That was a high level of respect among the Jews. And then, remember what we said about the goal of these disciples of the rabbis with smicha? It was to be like their rabbi. Not to be greater than, but to be like their rabbi. So when Jesus called these men, and you think about the men, Simon the Zealot, Matthew the tax collector, Judas who would end up betraying him, when he called them, in essence, he was saying to them, I believe that you can become like me, which is a great vote of confidence. And you see all the ups and downs through the 3 years of these disciples, and many times you despair and think these men will never be anything like Jesus. They're always questioning and doubting and misunderstanding and arguing. How are they going to be like this perfect rabbi? And yet he called them and shaped them, and then they became much more like him. And so again, you have this whole idea of these followers of the rabbi. Now let's talk about the concept a little bit more of following, because if we for example think about following in today's social media environment, you think about Facebook followers, you think about Twitter followers, and really there's nothing that you have to do except just click on something that says follow. And following in that case may mean that you keep up with what that person does or says, their opinions on different things, or not. You have the option of communicating with the person you're following, but if they have a lot of followers, it's likely they won't even notice you or respond to you at all. And so really, if you think about following Jesus as Twitter following, it's a super low commitment, and it's not at all what we would have in mind here in the Gospels. If you take a little bit different definition of following, if you think about following a professional team in a sport, especially if you're like in soccer, for example, then that takes a little bit more commitment, because you have the idea of going to the games if you can, going to all of them if you can. If you can't, at least watching them on TV and not missing a game. You talk about those teams with your friends and you defend those. Even if they lose, you're still a follower of them. You may invest some money and buy gear from the team, maybe a jersey or maybe hats or whatever, and you wear those just to declare your allegiance to your team. That's a little bit more committed as a follower. And there's actually people that get in fights and maybe even get hurt because they're following their team avidly. They're fanatics, they're fans of their team. But yet that doesn't get the idea either of what it meant to follow Jesus, because when Jesus says, I want you to follow me, it was far beyond Twitter following or professional team following. It was the idea of sharing a life. It was making a covenant that could cost you your life. It was the idea that they would want to be so much like Jesus and so close to Jesus that he would shape them and change them in every way, and eventually live in them through his Holy Spirit and live through them as they went out and tried to be faithful to him. And then along with that, they would receive the same rewards as Jesus and also be persecuted the same way. In John 15, Jesus says, look, if people listen to me, then they'll listen to you. If people persecute me, they'll persecute you. It comes with being my follower. And so this kind of following is a total commitment. And really, in some ways, we perhaps don't understand this. We're not used to this at all. Maybe we're more on the level of professional team following, where we buy in some, we're faithful to a certain group, we spend some money, we spend some time. But this kind of extreme commitment, where you give everything, is really the kind that Jesus is talking about. And later on, we'll talk about counting the cost of following Jesus and what that means for us in that way. But when these rabbis with smicha called their talmidim, then this is what they were talking about, this kind of total life commitment. Now, you think about Jesus' apostles, the list that we have here, kind of a strange mix, really. Jesus would have been better served in terms of his disciples getting along, to be more homogenous, to make sure they're all the same backgrounds, everything. But as we mentioned, you have a zealot who thinks it's okay to kill people that don't agree with him, that the Israeli nation is the most important. You have uneducated fishermen that may not have made the next level of education as children. You have a tax collector who everybody hated, who was affiliated with the Romans. There were probably many different ages represented among the disciples, and maybe even a Herodian. Maybe Judas was a Herodian from some of his contacts, maybe perhaps later. And so you think, wow, why did Jesus do that? He prayed all night, and this is the leading that he got from God to pick these men to follow him. How would that be? You wonder what Jesus would pick today. If he did his 12 after praying all night, what could that group look like? And I think that perhaps he would pick rich people and poor people, maybe a middle class or two. Probably pick somebody that has a PhD, probably pick a professional like a lawyer, or maybe a judge, or a dentist or someone like that, and probably also somebody that finished 6th grade and was a ditch digger maybe, or a manual laborer. He'd probably pick people who were Democrats and Republicans, and maybe, depending on where you were in the world, maybe a socialist or a communist, different people. He might pick gang members that had come out of that life and been immersed in that lifestyle. He might pick a prostitute or drug addicts. He might pick a civic leader that everyone respected and had a lot of authority. And really a lot of other people Jesus could have picked. You think about that diverse group and all of the problems that are implied and the disunity that from the very beginning, you think it's impossible to merge all those people into a loving community, diverse but unified. And yet that's what the church is all about. That's what he called the disciples to do. Go out, preach the word, make disciples of all nations, and included in that is all kinds of people, and then bring them back together and meld them into the church, just like I melded you as a group of Talmidim. Now, one other issue that we want to talk about today is how old were the disciples when they were called? And there's all kinds of opinions on this. If you look at the movies, if you look at pictures or portraits painted through the years, you see usually older men, beards and sideburns and gray hair. But it's actually possible that the disciples were pretty young when they were called. In fact, there's some clues in the text that suggest they may have been between 8 and 15 years old. And if you look at how they behaved, arguing about who's the greatest, that sounds like a group of high school guys in the locker room arguing about who's the best player or the best of anything. And so you think, could that actually be true? In some ways, that would fit. Because, for example, if you look at a story over in Matthew 17, go over there with me. Matthew 17, verse 24 and following, Jesus and his disciples are in Capernaum. And so the collectors of the 2 drachma tax, there's a certain tax that applied to Jewish men, came to Peter and asked, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax, the 2 drachma tax? Yes, he does, he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others? From others, Peter answered. Then the sons are exempt, Jesus said to him. But so that we may not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line. take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a 4-drachma coin. Take it and give it to them from my tax and yours. Just really quickly, this is a fascinating story where you have the idea that Jesus doesn't necessarily have to pay, but he'll pay just to be obedient to the custom there, which is good. And then the way he pays, Peter, go catch a fish, and inside that fish is our payment for both you and me, a 4-drachma coin. And so that's enough for just Jesus and Peter. And you look back and you think, who had to pay this tax? And it was only people that were 20 or older, 20 years or older. And so the suggestion here is, assuming that the disciples are around also, the suggestion is only Peter and Jesus were old enough to pay this tax. And so possibly Peter was married. We see that he has a mother-in-law later on. Peter is married, and Jesus, of course, is 30 at least or more by this story. And so maybe the rest of the disciples are under 20. And again, they acted like that sometimes. And also their passion that they had would be one of the things that Jesus wants to capitalize on as he trains them and sends them into ministry. And also we see that sometimes in the stories, when Jesus asks questions or a situation occurs, Peter's the one to step up and take the lead. He speaks first, he answers first. Matthew 16, who do men say that I am? Peter, steps right in and answers. Peter's the one who preaches at Pentecost. So maybe he is the oldest one and the leader because of that. And the rest are perhaps less than 20. Then if you add also what we've mentioned about some of the intro to the Gospels, and we mentioned John, how young John might have been. If you picture John as, say, like an 8 or a 9-year-old, that might make sense for what position he had with Jesus, kind of as the favorite of Jesus, as he's pictured in the Gospels, one of the inner circle of Jesus. And if he's a young boy that Jesus is kind of mentoring and training and encouraging, that can make sense. And then you think if he wrote his Gospel in the 90s, and we're talking about the 30s AD here, then he would have had to be really young to be able to still be alive in the 90s and write his Gospel and Revelation then. So again, something kind of surprising. It doesn't really matter in a sense because the disciples were the disciples and they did what they did no matter how old they were, but it helps us understand a little bit more maybe why they acted the way they did at certain times. Good, that's the second part then of class 12. Hope that this has been illuminating for you, and so in the next part of the class we'll focus on how rabbis taught. See you in that class.